Boa tarde a todos, todas. Good afternoon. Primeiramente, eu gostaria de agradecer as pessoas que estão aqui assistindo a live e também as pessoas que irão assistir esse vídeo depois da gravação. Se você não é inscrito no canal, nós pedimos que vocês se inscrevam agora. Isso ajuda o YouTube a entregar o nosso conteúdo para vocês. E para todos, já cliquem no link de gostei, porque nós temos a very special guest today. E nós teremos também um espaço reservado, ou melhor, um tempo reservado para interação. Então, vocês podem escrever em inglês ou português no chat questões, ou então comentários, que nós conversaremos com o professor Larry. Hoje aqui conosco, além do professor Larry Gruppen, nós temos também o professor Marcos Borges, que é vice-coordenador do Centro de Desenvolvimento Docente para o Ensino aqui da Faculdade de Medicina de Ribeirão Preto, e também a mais nova membro do grupo, professora Sinara Feliciano, que também é o nosso reforço hoje aqui. E, professor Marcos Borges, eu passo a palavra para o senhor para a apresentação do professor Larry.
Bom, boa tarde a todos e todas. É um prazer estar de novo conversando com vocês aqui. Hoje é um dia muito especial para a gente, né? Principalmente para mim. Eu estou aqui na Universidade de Michigan e eu vim fazer um pós-doutorado, como muitos sabem, sob orientação do professor Larry Gruppen. O professor Larry, ele é do departamento do Learning Health Science Department da Universidade de Michigan, e ele foi o chefe desse departamento na gestão anterior. O Larry, ele tem mais de 150 publicações indexadas no PubMed em educação das profissões da saúde. Ele participou ativamente do AAMCA, que é a Associação dos Colégios Americanos. Em 2015, ele recebeu 2 prêmios importantes aqui nos Estados Unidos. Um chama John Hubbard, que é o prêmio do National Board of Medical Examiners, e também um outro prêmio chamado Merrill Flair Award, que é do AAMCA. Todos eles relacionados à educação médica. 25 anos atrás, o Larry criou um programa de capacitação docente baseado em projetos de pesquisa, que chama MESP, Medical Education Scholars Program. Esse programa está há 25 anos formando pessoas para se tornarem melhores educadores e pesquisadores. Por causa do sucesso desse programa, ele criou um master, um mestrado em educação também, que é um programa totalmente voltado para competências. Então, é um programa que não depende do tempo. Você precisa atingir algumas competências para conseguir progredir. Então, um dos poucos programas totalmente baseado por competências. E ele tem muita expertise em diversas áreas, principalmente clinical reasoning e desenvolvimento docente. Mais que isso, o Larry é uma pessoa muito agradável. Eu falo que as nossas reuniões, que a gente faz reunião para discutir artigos, projetos, são reuniões em cafés. Então, a gente senta num café, geralmente no café perto de caixa no Songbird, e daí a gente tem uma conversa muito agradável. Então é muito legal essa mudança de paradigma, de sair daquela coisa formal para uma coisa mais informal, acho que acaba evoluindo muito mais. Eu vou fazer a apresentação dele agora em inglês, depois a gente vai passar a palavra para ele. So it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Larry Gruppen. Dr. Larry Gruppen is a professor of the Department of Learning Health Science at the University of Michigan. He's a former chair of the Department of Medical Education in the same institution. Larry has more than 150 publications in PubMed about medical education and health professional medical education. He has actively participated in the AAMCA, and he received 2 awards in 2015, the John Hubbard and the Merrill Flair, both of them related to education affairs. 25 years ago, he created the Medical Education Scholar Program. That's a program very interesting, based on developmental project, a research project. And after that, he created a master in the health professional education. That's a totally competence-based program. He has expertise in several areas, such as clinical reasoning and faculty development. And most of this, he's a very nice, very kind person. And first of all, I'd like to thank you, Larry, for everything you helped me and done with me. I have learned a lot with you, so thank you very much. And I'd like to start this presentation, asking you to explain your education background and how you became an educator. Please feel free to talk.
Oh, all right, I'll do that. And I want to take a couple of minutes to thank you all for this opportunity. It is a great, and I've enjoyed Marcos and all of our coffees we have every week, and we talk over many issues. I just regret that I can't address you all in Portuguese. And I have a little joke that maybe will translate, maybe it will not. But in English, if you can speak three languages, what would you call that person? You call them multilingual. They have multiple languages. If you have someone in English or someone who could speak two languages, what is the English term for that? Bilingual. So, what do you have when you have someone that speaks only one language? American. So, I've always been impressed with Marcos's ability to cross that linguistic boundary, and I apologize I can't do the same. But to answer your question, Marcos, I started with no intention of doing any research or any work in medical education. I started my college studies intending to be a psychologist. I was intending to learn to be a psychologist, become a faculty member in a small liberal arts school somewhere in the United States, and just teach students for the rest of my career. But after college, I got the opportunity to do my PhD studies at the University of Michigan. And that was a major uh, um, opportunity for me because in the United States, the University of Michigan is one of 8 colleges like Harvard and Cornell and University of California at San Francisco who produce almost 14% of all of the faculty in colleges and universities here in the US. So it is a major research institution, and being able to go from my small college to this enormous, internationally recognized university really changed a lot of my plans, not intentionally, but I started learning about psychology at the University of Michigan and discovered many, many additional opportunities that came along with coming to the university. So that really is one of the first points I would make about my career is that most of it was accidental. I didn't go with plans, with goals to become a faculty member at the University of Michigan. I never even thought of that. But a lot of what happens in my career was unexpected, and I think that was it's a fairly common experience. So anyway, going back to doing my PhD work in the Department of Psychology at the University of Michigan, the first job I had as a student, I was still a graduate student, but I started to work with an evaluation program that was evaluating a medical school curriculum, a curriculum that was designed to be innovative in a variety of ways, like combining a Bachelor of Science with a Master or an MD into one program. So I was working as a research assistant on that program, and I worked with that group for almost 5 years. And I learned a lot about medicine that I had never had any interest in. But I found that this was a very rich field of education that was aware of the need for experts in education. Most of the other professions, like engineering, like pharmacy, like business, they all taught their students by faculty who had that degree. So business faculty would teach business students. Pharmacy faculty would teach pharmacy students. Medicine was one of the few disciplines that recognized that there were other areas of specialization that they should take advantage of. And one of these was psychology and education itself, a recognition that doctors are experts in their medical field, but they may not be experts in education. So I was intrigued by that and began to wonder if that might be a direction for me to go in working on my degree program. So I learned more and more about medical education as a field, and I started to do more and more work with collaborators and colleagues in the medical school, more work there than I did in the School of Psychology. So when I finished my degree, one of my first opportunities was to work in the medical school in a department of medical education. Excuse me, which really was composed of people like me, of other social scientists in public health, in education, in psychology, and sociology, not very many physicians. And we were a department that worked with physicians as colleagues and collaborators to try to better understand the educational process in medicine and understand how we could improve that, how we could intervene with faculty to make them better teachers, to intervene with students to make them learn more efficiently and more effectively. So I got into medical education completely by accident. I never intended that, and I would never have been able to tell you that that was where I would be spending 40 years of my career.
Oh, thank you very much. And one of the fields that you have worked, like try to improve like the medical education, for my understanding, is clinical reasoning.
Yeah.
Right? So did you start like clinical reasoning studies just the beginning? Could you tell us some example of your research? How did you start to do research in clinical reasoning?
I will, yes, very good question. So, as a psychologist, I was always interested in the psychological processes that people go through to solve problems, to reason about issues and challenges. So, for me as a psychologist, to study clinical reasoning was an opportunity to study problem solving. And clearly, medicine is probably the most significant discipline for the importance of problem solving, reasoning about the patient's disease, about their symptoms, and about the treatment is something that is of concern to all of us as patients, and certainly for all of us as members of the medical education community to try to make people better at the reasoning process. So I was interested in problem solving, in clinical reasoning from the very beginning. And what I decided to do is to look at how people solve problems and perform clinical reasoning with patients who were arriving in the medical clinic for a new disease or a new problem, a new symptoms. And they would come and they would see a resident to get some initial, answer some questions, get some initial information, and provide a preliminary diagnosis. I worked with those residents to give them a little questionnaire that would give me some additional information about what they were thinking about when they made that decision. And I asked them questions, not what the disease was. I collected that data, but that wasn't the important thing. I wanted to find out from their perspective, was this a new disease to them? Had they not seen this particular complaint before, or was this something that they were familiar with? So a question of novelty. I wanted to ask them how difficult they found this case to be. Was this an obvious diagnosis, or was this one that took a lot of thought, a lot of question and answers before they could determine that? So the difficulty of the problem. And somewhat related to that was a question I had of how often have you seen this kind of problem before? So if this was a sore throat, they have probably seen sore throats many, many times. If it was a heart problem, that might be less familiar to them. So I was asking them questions about what was interesting, how much experience they had with it, and how difficult this particular problem was. And then I took those three characteristics of clinical reasoning and I linked them to some other variables that we typically don't think about when we think about clinical reasoning. And the main theme that I was concerned with was interest. How do physicians find interest in new cases? Or at what point do they become bored and possibly burned out? There's a lot of work in psychology that examines how people find interest in different situations, different problems, different opportunities. But this hadn't been done in medicine. So I asked, in addition to those three questions I just mentioned, what I thought was an important question of tell me how interesting this case is. And the short version of it is that I found that residents found cases interesting that were, first of all, novel. If it was a new case, something they hadn't seen before, this was kind of cool. I'd be interested in this. Let's learn more about it. They were interested in problems that were that they hadn't seen that were more difficult, more challenging. So a simple problem, not that interesting. More complex, more challenging problems were interesting. And problems that they hadn't seen before were also interesting. So maybe this is interesting, maybe it's not. But to find out that the factors, the characteristics that made a problem interesting were different for different residents. Some would find a case of a heart complaint to be very interesting because they hadn't seen this before. It's an interesting challenge. It was a diagnostic dilemma. Others who were seeing the same problem might not find that interesting because they had already encountered it. They had, it was nothing particularly new. So I found that in addition to this, so the summary was that what makes a problem interesting is very different from one person to another. But I also found out by comparing residents who were in their first year to residents who were in their third year that those with more experience, the third year residents, were much more interested in problems that involved a challenge for the patient. So that if the patient had a life-threatening disease or a challenging treatment problem or challenging issue in management, those were more interesting for those residents than were the case for first year residents. First year residents were interested in relatively simple things like, had I seen this before, or was this an unusual case? So the summary of this that was part of my dissertation was basically to identify that as people become experts, and all of you are experts, and you can think about this in your own way, but as you become more and more expert, the things that you find interesting change. What was interesting at the very beginning becomes becomes familiar, becomes customary, ordinary. There's nothing particularly interesting. And you have to find more challenging, more unusual, novel situations to really find something that makes you interested. So it was one way to look at not only um, a dynamic in clinical reasoning that focuses on emotions more so than just thinking, but also part of clinical reasoning that tries to understand how people change as they become experts.
This is very interesting because this is still happening. We have seen some residents, like let's say more common cases, let's say diabetes, hypertension. Sometimes the residents, they say, I don't want to see this patient again. I want to see something very different, very unusual, very rare. But this is not the life. Okay. So, and even patient, like if they have the same disease, they are different. So the patient has a history of life. You have like something that can change.
Mm-hmm.
So this is important, but it's a challenge. How can you teach residents and students if they don't see several patients many times? So this is a big challenge.
It is, because you don't really have any, excuse me, you don't have very much control over what kind of patients a resident is going to be able to see. It's often, certainly for us, it's a very random process. So I think what we discovered was that the more experienced you become as a physician, the more mental space you have to think about more complex issues. So as a first year medical student, your attention, your mental capacity is absorbed by some basic information, how mechanisms of disease work, on vocabulary, on tests, all kinds of information to try to fit into this limited space. But as you become an expert, that space in effect becomes larger, largely because you're familiar with so much of the information that previously was new. Now all of this information is kind of a small package that you can use and apply to other information, new information that you can now, as an expert, pay more attention to and think about. So we were thinking much the same is true for their interest in specific patients. It may not be the disease. Another case of diabetes that's interesting. Another case of diabetes is not particularly novel, but it's how that disease affects the patient, how you need to, as a physician, take that disease and translate it into a treatment program to manage this patient over time. That becomes a very different kind of problem. And I would argue that although for students we often focus on diagnosis as the nature of the problem, in reality and in practice, most of your time as a physician is spent in treatment. You know what the patient has, but over months, over years, you need to treat them for a chronic disease, a repeating disease, and those then become very different kinds of problems.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. One thing that I found a little different from some people in Brazil, we think clinical reasoning more about how we make the diagnosis. But I think in your understand, you think clinical reasoning more broader, like not just the diagnosis, but the management. Like, could you make some comments? Like, how can we define clinical reasoning? Because this is important to compare like the studies and the context.
Yeah, that's a really challenging question. It's one thing that I and some co-authors have written a manuscript on, is that clinical reasoning as a term is so complex. There are so many different, if you're just thinking of the mental process, there are so many components of what you're thinking and how you're thinking that go into this one word or two words of clinical reasoning, that it becomes almost too complicated to really work with. So it's often better, simpler to focus on uh, some part of clinical reasoning. So making a diagnosis, that's a very clear component of clinical reasoning, but it's only one. And it is a kind of problem that basically is asking you to classify this example, this patient in front of you, to classify them as an example or an instance of this disease, this category. And you can do this based on different information. We'll put this person in a different category and trying to sort the knowledge and the information from questions to help you decide which category or which disease is the appropriate one to use to label this person is a very complex process in itself. But it's not all there is to clinical reasoning. If there are any of you there, well, you do this every time you look at an x-ray. A lot of clinical expertise is visual, is being able to look at patterns. So you look at patterns in x-rays, you look at patterns in EKGs, in EEGs, you look at patterns in how someone looks. Do they look ill, or do they look frail, or do they look pale? So there's so much information that you take in just by visual interaction. That too is a part of clinical reasoning. And if you do research on experts in radiology, you quickly find that they are looking at an x-ray in a different way from a beginner or a junior medical student. They just look for different things without even thinking about it. So pattern recognition is also clinical reasoning, but it's different from diagnosis. And then, Marcos, as you mentioned, things that we have done hardly any real research on is how do you do clinical reasoning, and that involves a treatment and management. How do you decide when to make a specific prescription to use a certain drug in this situation? When do you decide that it's time to change from one medication to another? When do you recognize that it's time to ask for a consultation? So all of the things that are related to your treatment and management of a patient is an aspect of clinical reasoning, but it's much more than just a diagnosis. So when we focus on diagnosis as the definition of clinical reasoning, we're really focusing on a very specific aspect of clinical reasoning, and one that's very important, no question about that. But there are so many more complex operations that we as experts engage in with our cognition and our perception and our understanding, that just classifying somebody as having a diagnosis is just a simple subset of all of the larger questions we could ask.
Thank you, Professor. It's a very interesting and broad vision of clinical reason, and it makes clear the relevance and complexity to study this field. But turning to another issue, other important issue, you have a number of publications on competency-based learning. Could you introduce us on this field too, please?
I'm sorry, what was the question? So
The competence-based learning, your publications on competence-based learning.
Okay, yeah, competency-based learning is, so I want to remind you that I was trained as a psychologist. I received no formal training in teaching. So I was not any better at teaching when I started than most any other faculty member. So a lot of what I have learned by being in the medical school in this medical profession is a lot about the learning process. How do people acquire knowledge? How do they apply it? And particularly more and more is how do we organize a curriculum to help people learn quicker, to learn better, to remember longer. And I came to understand that there were many aspects of building a curriculum, of forming a curriculum for a medical school that were important, but often there were decisions that were made more on tradition than on science. So we've always had courses that were designed to deal with a topic. And we always provide people with an introduction, a baseline set of information before they can go on into more advanced levels. And we have lots of educational practices that we have been doing for centuries without really understanding or knowing if it is the best way. So it's been very interesting over the last 10 to 20 years that there is a growing awareness that the way we have done teaching in college, in elementary school, and certainly in professions education may not be the right way, may not be the best way. And instead of structuring education to make it organizationally convenient, we should look at organization or look at uh, education from the perspective of the learner. And competency-based education is a framework that's designed to really focus on the learner rather than on the teacher. And the competency-based framework will say there's few basic principles that I think are very, very important. One is that your curriculum should be about learning, not about teaching. In other words, it's not the faculty who are the most important people here. It's not the faculty who should be, deciding what students need to learn, because students know in many cases what they already know, and they know what they don't know. So they are often they're better judged themselves of what they need to learn than the faculty are. Faculty, we do medical schools to make life easy, convenient for the faculty. So faculty know when exams are going to be, they know when they have to teach, when the semester starts, when it ends, how many sessions they will have with the students. All the organization and the structure is designed for the faculty, not for the students. So there's nothing to say that the students are going to learn best by having um, biochemistry before communication skills. So the sequence that we have for the curriculum is not driven by the students' needs. So competency-based education is a framework that emphasizes the students. The students play a major role in deciding what they learn, also on how they learn it. There is a major emphasis in clinical or competency-based education on assessment, so that people who graduate from a competency-based program have been tested and can demonstrate that they have the skills and the knowledge that they need, not to take a multiple choice test, which doesn't really correlate with competence in most situations. And then the third, maybe the fourth one, very important to me, is that competency-based education is flexible in time. So we say that it takes 4 years in Michigan to make a physician. Nobody can tell you where that 4 years came from. It's somewhere in history. We made that decision that it takes 4 years. There's just so much information And we can do it all in 4 years. 3 isn't enough, 5 is too many. So there's this mystical magic about 4 years. Clinical or a competency-based education says basically you finish when you're competent. It may be shorter for some people. It may actually be longer for others. But it's the essence is that you can demonstrate you're competent and you keep working on it. You keep practicing, you keep learning until you are.
It's very interesting, Larry. And for me, it makes sense. But there is one challenge that it should fit this principle in the real world, because you need the students to come and go. You need to make like, so can you explore more this idea? How can you fit these principles with the real world, like schools calendar and
yeah, it's
Just
extremely
to
difficult.
add something, Professor, how you assess students in this competence-based education? What's the whole of assessment? Just to add.
Yeah. So there are many things that you need to do to make this a real world possibility. Assessment is one of them. If you don't trust multiple choice tests, you need to find something better. And those are often much more difficult to do. So standardized patients, clinical faculty observing patients or students interacting with patients, complex oral exams. There are various ways to assess outcomes that are more trustworthy, more useful than the standard multiple choice, but they're difficult and they're expensive. So assessment is a big one. The time is usually the biggest problem, because of medicine is taught in the same environment in which it's practiced. So the time is taken. The time is configured more for patient care than it is for teaching. So you try to teach in the moments you have available when you're not taking care of patients. And that's true for the whole institution. So it's first and foremost a clinical environment, and secondarily is an educational environment. So we can't let students practice and practice and practice because we have time constraints of patients that need to have a procedure done. And we can't let students, sometimes we can't let them go too quickly because we don't have room for them in the next phase of education for them to do the learning and practice that they need there. So it's assessment, it's time, and it's trust. When we're in like ours, a 4-year medical school, they built that into our history such that we trust that everybody who made it through medical school in 4 years must be good enough to be a physician. And we have no assessment beyond that. It's just amount of time. Competency-based learning, often you don't have that. You don't have the 4 years. You don't have a fixed amount of time. So you have to have some other way that your faculty can decide whether they trust the graduates to be competent. And again, it goes back to assessment, but it's also the interactions that you have as faculty with students, and the time and the opportunities to really get to know the students' capabilities become much more challenging in a real world practice setting than in the curricula that we can develop on paper.
Oh, thank you. Hey, it is a challenge, but I think you have two examples, like not in medical education, but if you think about faculty development, you created like two programs. One is a time-based, that's MESP, and the other one is the master. That's a competency-based program.
Right.
Like, could you compare? Like, could you say to us like the advantage and disadvantage of both of them, please?
So the medical education scholars program, both of these are at Michigan. The MESP is an extended faculty development program. It lasts for about 9 months. It is every Wednesday afternoon, I believe, and faculty are selected as they apply to about 12 or 15 slots. And those 12 or 15 faculty meet every week for almost 4 hours to learn about a series of topics that are important for medical education. So these might be topics on how do you develop a curriculum? How do you assess knowledge? What does professionalism look like? How do you coach students? How do we learn about clinical reasoning? What do we know about burnout and stress? So lots of different topics, one for each week, and that gives faculty a broad exposure to many topics in education and an opportunity to work together to get to know each other over the course of 9 months and conduct a curriculum project. So it's a combination of learning by hearing and learning by doing. You have your projects that you do and your sessions that you attend and listen. And this has been a program that has, as I said, it's about 12 faculty each year, and that's been going on for 25 years. So we've got a lot of faculty in the medical school who have had this fairly intensive exposure to educational topics and makes them more sophisticated, wherever department they may be housed, to conduct education in a more sophisticated manner. So that has been an important resource for the Michigan's medical school to have faculty who have that level of expertise. It's far from a degree program. There's much more that they can and need to learn, but it gives them a much more complex, much more a scientific way to think about education. The second excuse me, second program that Marcos mentioned was the medical education, the Master's in Health Professions Education. This is a master's degree program. This program is entirely and explicitly competency based. So we do not have a length of time that you have to be in this program. We don't have a specific date for you to start. You get to decide that as a learner based on how much experience you've had as an educator, where you want to be, what goals you might have, and you can start anytime during the year, and you can work quickly or you can work slowly to get out in 2 years or to take 5, maybe 6 years. So it's entirely flexible and entirely based on the students' determination of what they want to learn and when they want to learn it. The faculty are responsible for assessment. So we evaluate every competency that the learners acquire, that they provide evidence for, and we, the assessors, look at that evidence and determine whether or not the evidence of their research methodology or evidence of their awareness of educational theory or leadership, whether those skills, those competencies are sufficient for us to trust this individual and give them credit for that competency. So they can they have to demonstrate that competence twice for each learner during the course of their program, and they can graduate from the program whenever they have 32 of those credits acquired. But the main thing is that it's based on projects, not courses. So we don't have a class on statistics. You learn the statistics in the context of a project or a paper that you're writing or a paper that you're reviewing. Similarly, with the other competencies, there are projects and activities that you do as a member of the faculty that give you the opportunity to demonstrate these skills and make the application of these skills very pragmatic. So we can do this competency-based education. And as far as we know, we're the only master's program in certainly the health professions education in the world that has gone all the way to a competency-based framework. And we could do this because we didn't have any existing program that we had to fit into. So we could start from a blank slate, set up our own standards, our own rules. We run this administratively through the medical school, not through our graduate school. So we can have much more flexibility and freedom to do that. And it's been a very exciting project for me over the past 10 years. And I'm very proud of our learners who have gone through that.
And how is the perception? Like, do the learners like this kind of program? Because a center-learned program is interesting, but it depends on the learner. So how is their feeling?
Yeah, the learners have to be very self-motivated. They have to be disciplined, and that's true for most of the physicians. To be a physician takes somebody who is dedicated, motivated, committed to high standards of work and performance. So these are not characteristics that are unusual. But what we've discovered and we realize is that medical school really does spend a lot of time telling the students what to do. So the students are told when to go to this class and when to have this exam, what's required. They have to know this, they have to know that. There really isn't that much opportunity to decide for themselves what they want to learn and how they want to learn it. Most of medical school, college, even a lot of our elementary school is the same way. We tell people what to learn and we give and then we teach them. So this requirement of our master's program to be self-sufficient, self-directed, is surprisingly difficult for people who are otherwise very, very successful. And really just demonstrate that to acquire to be your own teacher is a role that we're not very familiar with.
Thank you. I think there we have a question from the people that are watching. Lucy, can you? Okay.
I think it's a question regarding undergraduation medical course, not about the national guidelines that define some Brazilian national guidelines that define some competencies desired for the future professional, and how to combine these views.
Yeah, that is something I have a good friend in one of our previous deans who is a physician, but also a very, very strong educator. And we would talk a lot about this very problem, that medicine, like many other educational programs, is set up to produce a specific, call them a product. So we are going to produce a physician. And this physician should be able to deal with a whole range of problems, situations, of diseases, of patients, because an MD doesn't limit you to anything. It's a general degree in that sense. Very much like a doctorate in psychology. You know, you're trained as a psychologist, but are all the psychologists the same? Not at all. Are all physicians the same? Even less so. Physicians are dealing with entirely different situations in different locations with different specialties. So there's a fundamental flaw, I think, in this idea that there should be a profile for physicians, that they need to have these competencies, these skills, this knowledge, so that everybody's the same. That's not true in real life, and it shouldn't be true in our theory or our conceptualization of education. Every physician, they have an MD, but every MD is different. And I think it's more important for us to recognize that um, students are starting to specialize, starting to focus very early, even perhaps before medical school. So they know when they come to medical school, they want to be a surgeon. And that guides a lot of where they spend their time, what they read, who they work with, where their motivation lies, and having a general list of competencies that you have in Brazil, we have in the U.S., is more of a political statement about what we as a profession, how we define ourselves, than it is a description of any individual. That's all my personal opinion. You know, it's clearly not the way the United States licensing system works or sees the process.
Thank you, Larry. Another thing I found very interesting about the research there is about I think there was a change, I don't know when, about the framework, the theories that you make research and the results needs to be related to a previous framework or theory. I think in the past this was not necessary to publish a paper, but I think the journals now are changing. Could you explain about it, please?
Yeah, it's so I'll go back again to when I started in graduate school. And I started doing work in medical education. And I was irritated by many of the articles that would spend great lengths of the article on some theory or another, and they would describe the theory. They would explain why this was important, how it fit into this study, and I looked at it and said, I only care about the results. That's all that matters. Don't worry, don't bother me with all of this theory stuff, because it's different for each person. And over the course of the 40 years I've been doing this, I've come to understand how wrong I was. That an important part of our research in health professions education is understanding the big picture, not the little data. It's not the findings that are the critical thing. It's understanding the big picture. So now I have come completely around, and I will look at papers that are that have a good study but no theory as being inferior, because the importance of theory lies in it lies in the complexity of education. Any given phenomenon or problem or situation in education is complex because it involves people, it involves their background, their motivation, their life experiences, so many things that we can't all manage in our head at any one time. So what we need is some way to understand, some framework, some model, some example or illustration that we can use to try to understand this complexity. And that's fundamentally what a theory is. It's a way to take part of reality, describe it, make it understandable, make it small enough for us to think about, and then to link that little piece of the problem to another problem or another piece. So that now instead of just having data, we have meaning. And that meaning is really critical for the health professions education to really understand the way the human mind works and the way education works and how we should try to design curricula, structures, organizations, institutions in ways that are going to help the larger society have the healthcare that we care about, not the individual bits and pieces of data.
Well, thank you there. We are coming to the end, so we have more, maybe 4 or 5 minutes. So many of the people that are watching or will be watching, there are people that they want to start doing some research in health professional education. So I'd like to ask like the last question, like for you, like if you have like any advice, anything that you can share to them, like how to start doing research, like which is the main challenge, how can you translate your experience to the new people that are starting the field?
I have lots of advice on that, but I think the one thing that I would highlight is, for me, again, after 40 years, the most important thing is don't try to do a study by yourself. Doing research, doing any educational work by yourself is just extremely difficult because you are always doing your educational study, your work, your teaching. You're doing it after you've done all of your clinical work. So it's always a secondary priority. And you need to have someone else, a collaborator, a partner, someone, a team member that you can work with, you can talk to, you can share ideas with, because that keeps you motivated. Finding a good partner or a collaborator is also can bring in a new area of expertise that you haven't had before. But it is so important to have a commitment that I make to you that I will have these 2 paragraphs written on our paper by next week. And because and now that I've told you that I'll do that, that's a promise that I'm more likely to keep than if I tell it to myself. So work with other people, find collaborators, find partners, find people who are interested in the same thing. And along with this is that you will not necessarily find those partners in your institution. Those of us interested in education are a small number, so you will probably need to look outside of your institution. But educators are, by a wide margin, some of the most helpful, friendly people that you'll find. Because, well, as educators, they want to help people learn, help people do better. So if you find something in the literature, an article that you think is kind of has a nice idea that you'd like to learn more about, don't hesitate to contact one of the authors, because well, first of all, they love to know that somebody's reading their stuff. That's always encouraging. But they're generally very happy to give you advice, to talk about some ideas, to maybe even start a project together, because we're all looking for people to work with. And those who work by themselves are very uncommon. Not very many of us can do that. And I think often those who work by themselves are missing opportunities that really make working in education a great deal of fun.
Oh, perfect.
Thank you, Professor. I'm hitting myself to give you 3 more space. And every time I show up, it's time to end. I hate this position, but anyone would like to talk about anything?
No, I'd like to just thank you, Larry, for this talk. It was great, as the others we have had. So thank you again, Senara.
Thank you.
I just thank you, Dr. Larry, to share so important topics with us about health professions education and how do research in this field. And it's a good pleasure to meet you.
And I wish you all the best.
In behalf of the CDDE, we appreciate the people from home who were watching. Professor Sinara and Professor Marcos, thank you so much for your availability. Oh God. And Professor Larry, thank you so much for your kindness on sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.